Okay, so welcome back to Racial and Ethnic Minorities, Spring 2022. All right, so this week, you have your exam one, okay? So we're gonna talk about that a little bit, and then we're also going to talk about the contemporary attitudes about interracial dating and marriage, and then also Asian American sexual politics. So we talked about language last time. We talked about you had the quiz over Native Americans and language, and so here we're going to talk about now interracial dating, interracial marriage, and then also talk about Asian American politics. So now we're kind of getting into the intersection of a lot of these topics, not just talking about this racial group, this racial group, this racial group, but also adding in how does race and gender affect the experiences that these groups have, or that the experiences that these groups have to deal with, right? What are some of the consequences around race and gender and sexuality? And as they come together, what does that mean for the life chances for these groups? What has happened historically with certain groups when we look at these intersections? What are some of the current or contemporary attitudes and situations that are occurring with some of these groups at their intersection? Okay, so we talked a little bit about intersectionality, particularly when we discuss critical race theory. So just kind of continuing on that and applying that to various groups. So first we want to talk about the exam. So your exam one will be available on Friday, February 18th at midnight. So you have February 17th, which will be that Thursday, this Thursday. And then it will, 11:59 when it becomes February 18th at midnight, 12 a.m. Then your exam will be available, okay? Your exam will be available. You will have 24 hours to complete the exam. So you will have from February 18th at midnight all the way till 11:59 on February 18th to complete your exam. And there will be about 30 to 40 questions on the exam. The questions for the exam will be available under the assignments tab on the link that says exam one. Okay, exam one. So if you go into your Canvas and then you go to where it says assignments, you'll see, I think it's at the top, you'll see exam one. Go in there and then you click the questions, okay? Now, same way with your quizzes, you can download the questions and answer them on the document and then save your document with the answers and then upload them. Or you can download the questions and then record the number and the answers on a separate document. So for example, if the questions are, if you say 1 is C, 3 is D, 5, 4, 1 is C, 2 is B, 3 is D, 5 is E, 6 is critical race theory, 7 is racial formation theory or something like that, you can do that, however you want to do that. Or you can just, answer the questions on the actual document. It's actually easier to do the former for me to grade, so I can just kind of go down and, but you can do it either way. I'm not going to force you to do it one way just because it's easier for me. But just make sure that whatever answers you give, make sure it's clear. So if you answer it on the same page, maybe answer it, put the answers in red or something like that. So that it's just easy for me to grade. Sometimes students don't do that. They do it in these weird ways, and I'm looking, I'm like, so where's the answer? So whatever you do, just please make sure that it's clear, highlighted in a different color or something. Or, if you just want to bold it, whatever it is that stands out that lets me know this is the answer for the question, that would help me out a lot. So either that, or you can just record it on a separate document. So you will submit your answers under the assignments tab, exam 1 in Canvas before the deadline. So it'll be an assignment. It'll be assignment. So you'll download the questions, you'll answer the questions, and then you will upload it. You will submit it just like you submit any of your other assignments. Okay. So that is that before the deadline. Next slide. Just a couple of things to help you prepare, and just some things that I want to, just some suggestions I want to make before going into the exam, so that there are as few excuses as possible. Okay, because sometimes I get a lot of those, and so I try to, talk about it on the front end so that students can be prepared. Obviously, if an emergency happens and you have to, you're in the hospital or something like that, that's different. But anything else, any other reason, if you don't turn in the exam, it's likely that I won't make any allowance for it, because you've seen this on the syllabus for a while. So yeah, just make sure that you're available, you're prepared, and on Friday you find some time to set aside to take this exam. So please be sure to type the correct answer next to the correct number. If you do not, it can throw off your entire exam, and this can cause the rest of your answers to be wrong. So for example, if there are 35 questions on the exam and you decide that one is A, 2 is C, 3 is D, 4 is E, and then let's say as you're typing, you skip 6, but you're looking at 5, and number 5 is E, but you put E for number 6 on your paper, then everything else is going to be thrown off. So then you might get to the end of your test, and you may see, oh, I got 36 questions, and this only has 35. Something is off. It's going to throw you all the way off. Now you can submit it, and then I'm gonna look and be like, well, they have 36, but it's 35. All the ones from where you messed up, to the end are gonna be wrong. And even some before that, depending on if they're right or wrong, but definitely the ones after the mix-up. So make sure if you're doing it that way, you're paying attention to the numbers and paying attention to the answers that you're putting for the numbers, and you're letting me know that this is the answer to the question. Okay. Upload the document with your answers in Word or PDF format, just like everything else. I think it's only happened once in this class. So make sure that everything that you upload is in Word or PDF format. Don't do it in Pages. Don't do it in some other ones. I've actually seen some other ones that ended up working, so I didn't take points off. But if you upload it in a format that I cannot read, you can take a chance. But if you upload it in a format that I cannot read, then you'll get a 0. So if I were you, I would just do it in Word. No matter what system you have, no matter what hardware you have, you upload it in Word. Okay. Unfortunately, I will get one or more of the following responses. My device stopped working, my Wi-Fi was down, my Canvas was not working, it would not allow me to upload. Can I email you the screenshot of it not working? And I'm saying that because I've gotten all of those reasons why a student can't submit an example 4. And so it's likely that if you give me any of these reasons as to why you couldn't submit your exam on time, more than likely I won't give you any leeway or any allowance for that. I want you to prepare and overly prepare, right? And this is just getting you ready for real life. So I know for me, if I have something that is coming up, I'll give you a real life example. I've been having meetings after meetings after meetings for the search that we're doing, and my computer is an old computer. And so sometimes it'll just randomly want to update, or sometimes things will go awry and I can't jump into the meeting at the time, but I always have my phone. My phone is a new phone and it's always ready. So if I can't jump on the meeting on my laptop because it's just being, stupid, then I'll jump on the meeting on my phone to make sure that I have a backup. Because at the end of the day, if I'm not at this meeting, it throws off the search. This has larger effects for the department, right? So I have to have a backup. And so that's what I expect for you to be able to do. And that's just what I'm preparing you for. Now, you can just depend on your device if you want to, and if your device is reliable, then that works. But if I were you, I would have a backup. So make sure that you are on a device where you can download and upload the exam. Make sure you're somewhere where you can have Wi-Fi. If your Wi-Fi goes down, make sure that there's another place that you can go, either on campus or friend's house, where you can download and answer the questions to the exam and upload it. Late and or email submissions will result in significant point deduction. After an hour, you will not be able to submit the exam at all. So if it becomes 12 the next day and you have not submitted the exam, there's significant point deduction. If by 1 a.m. you still have not submitted the exam, it's likely that I won't give you any points at all. If I do, it's very, 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 very little. So I want to make sure that I'm just fair to every person that's taking the exam. Everybody that's taking the exam took the time, either off work or prepared or away from their family or whatever, to take the exam and prepare for it. I want to make sure that they are given the grade that they deserve, and that someone who has not, that there are some consequences for that. Okay. So again, it's all about preparation and it's all about backup, because we know that technology is not always reliable. I know that with my laptop. That's why I have a reliable phone. So when I can't jump on a meeting in my laptop, I jump on a meeting on my phone, or vice versa, right? I always have my laptop up, prepared, running early because I know it's slow, all these different things. So just to make sure that I'm, prepared, because, as you get older, people expect you to be responsible. And a lot of people don't like excuses, even if they're very good. Excuses just don't really work a lot of times. So these are some of my suggestions for the exam. Submit the exam early. Number one, don't submit it late. Submit the exam early as possible. Some people will wait. I've seen it. Some people may submit the exam at 11:59. Or I've seen some people submit it at 11 a.m. or 11:45. That's cutting it close, but if it went through, great. I'm glad. I'm happy for you, But there have been times where students have said, oh, I was getting ready to submit it, and then my phone died, my laptop died, it started updating. I don't know what it is. You got a whole 24 hours. If I were you, I would submit it early. If you get it done at 8, I've even had students tell me that it was done at 8 and then they forgot to submit it. They left, picked something to eat, watched TV, fell asleep, woke up, and never submitted their exam. And that's horrible. You did all that work and then you didn't submit it. Just go ahead and submit it. I mean, that way you're done. You don't even have to think about it no more. So submit your exam early as possible. Okay, that's one suggestion that I make. My next suggestion: complete the exam. I don't know everybody's technology situation or Wi-Fi situation, but complete the exam in the library next to a computer with your laptop, just in case you can't upload it on your laptop. Then maybe you could email it to yourself and then upload it on the library computer. Some people might do that. Like, you know what? I don't have another device at home. All I have is my laptop. Let me take this laptop to the library. That way, I can do it on the library's computer. I can upload it, or I can do it on my laptop in the library and upload it. If something crazy happens, I could just email it to myself and upload it on the computer, or something happens with the computer library, email it to myself, upload it on my laptop, whatever. I do that all the time. I have backup drives and all these different things, and email important documents to myself, because you never know. So you all have lived with technology for a long time, so you know how important it is to back up your information. Number 3, if you're having trouble, make sure you save the document, restart your device, and then upload the document. Sometimes that has to happen. Again, I've had that happen with meetings or something that I'm doing. That happened yesterday when I was working on my book, and my computer was just doing what it does. And I had to start it over and restart my device. It is what it is. So that's why make sure you get to this early, so that you can get started. And just in case anything happens, if you have to restart your device and it's 8 p.m. or 6 p.m., that's better than if you have to restart your device and it's 11:45, because we don't know what can happen. Or if it's 11:50 or 11:52 or 55. So make sure that you are doing this early so that you can give yourself time for any hiccups, okay? Please reach out to me if you have any questions. Email me, inbox me. What was I gonna say? You can jump on my Zooms, because we're done with the search committee, the search meetings this for this past, last week we were done. So feel free to jump on if you have any questions about the exam. Okay. All right. Let's see. So what is your exam going to cover? Your exam will cover all of the information from the beginning of the class up until exam 1. So everything from the beginning, sociological imagination and all of that, all the way up until today. We're talking about contemporary attitudes towards interracial marriage. You will find various types of questions, mostly multiple choice, fill in the blanks, maybe some fill in the blanks. I might have some short answer on there. I'm not really sure yet, but mostly fill in the blanks and short answer. Okay. And yeah, and if you just want to know what's going to be on the exam, or sometimes you just want to know what should I focus on, everything. It'll probably be an even amount of questions per PowerPoint, per slide, not per slide, per PowerPoint, per lecture. So yeah, in terms of how you would study, I would suggest studying your notes. I would suggest studying your PowerPoint lectures. That is what I would suggest you study. I would not suggest going back and rereading all of that material. Now, that's only if you've already read it. If you have not read the material, then I would suggest that you go and read the material and then look at the lectures, because then that explains the material, and then you study that. But if you've already read it, I wouldn't go back and reread all of that. I will focus on the PowerPoints. I will focus on the lectures. I will focus on the notes. I will focus on the things that I've been talking about, and hopefully you have been taking notes on the material. Okay. Good. So if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out. So first thing we're gonna do, going to the next slide, there are 2 YouTube links. And I want you to look at these 2 YouTube links. first one and the second. And after that, we're going to talk about the topic for today. All right, so you should have watched both of those links. And what you see is clips from two different films, right? And actually these films kind of, well, the second one feeds off of the first one. So the first film is called Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? And we're going to talk more about that film later on in the lecture. But Guess Who's Coming to Dinner is a movie that came out in the late 1960s. So shortly around the time of the, of the civil rights movement, towards kind of the ending of the civil rights movement, or of its height, this movie came out called Guess Who's Coming to Dinner? And it's a movie about a Black man and a white woman meeting each other, and they want to get married. They plan on being together. The second one is called Guess Who? And this film is kind of the opposite. It was released in the early 2000s, and it's about, you can kind of tell, it's about a Black woman who goes off to college and meets a white man and brings this guy home to meet her family. So it's kind of Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, but in reverse. So we're going to talk about those. We're going to talk about those movies a little bit later. But I first want to ask you this question. Have you ever been in or are close to anyone who is in an interracial relationship? So, yes. Yes. In terms of that question. What was it like? Right? What was it like? If you care to share, or even if you just want to think about it. What was that relationship like? If you were in it, or if you were close to somebody and you saw how they interacted with each other, was it a healthy relationship? Was it not a healthy relationship? Did race play a role in how your relationship was able to develop? Did you feel comfortable? Were you always on the edge? Did the person say racist things? Did you say racist things? How did you begin to understand, or how did your understanding of race change or grow? Or how did it develop, or how were you challenged by this experience? Okay. And then what type of responses did you get from other people? Because as we know, when we're in relationship with somebody, whether it's a same racial relationship, intra-racial relationship, or an interracial relationship, either way, people are going to look. People are going to want to know who you're dating, who you're marrying, who you decide that you want to sleep with. All right, it's not just about you and that person, but there's family members that may be involved. There are friends that are looking on. So a person's relationship is not just personal, it's communal. And then especially if you decide that you want to marry this person, because now this person is going to be a part of the family. And so they may have either a say or an influence in some of the decisions that you may make in terms of who you decide that you want to date and or marry. So what type of responses did you get from people, or did you see your friends, if you've never been in an interracial relationship, but you saw your friends in one, what type of responses did it seem like they received? Right. So these are just some of the things to think about when we're looking at interracial relationships or interracial marriages, etc. On to the next slide. America's approval of interracial marriage has actually increased substantially over the years, right? So as we know, there was a time where interracial marriage was not was frowned upon at one point. Interracial marriage was not only frowned upon, but at one point it was illegal, right? Again, this goes back to the days of chattel slavery and U.S. enslavement of Africans in the Americas. And as more and more African people were brought over to the Americas, initially, during the enslavement process, any person that was born from the blood of a white person and an African person, they had the opportunity, if they had free blood in them, they were able to be free, right? The child was. If the child was mixed race. The only people that could be enslaved were people with pure African blood. This was shortly after the law that was passed to make the enslavement process a process forever. So as we know, initially, people who were brought over during American chattel slavery, during the transatlantic slave trade, these people were indentured servants. They worked for, a short amount of time, and then they were allowed to go back, or they were allowed to stay in the country and work and be citizens of the country. But what early Europeans, early colonists started to realize was that they weren't going to make as much money. And so they decided, since I'm not going to make as much money, it's just better for us to just keep them enslaved for the rest of their natural life. So soon they passed a law saying that once you were enslaved, you were always enslaved. And this is what made the transatlantic slave trade and the transatlantic slave experience much different from the slavery experiences of the past. There were very few times in history where you saw someone being enslaved for the remainder of their life, right? Usually it was for a certain time and then they would be released. But they said if a person was born of mixed race, white blood and black blood, then they would be free because the white person would not want to enslave their own child. Okay, makes sense. However, over time, that law began to change. And eventually, they made a law saying that a person who was born of mixed race, right? Person who was born of mixed race, any or one drop of African blood or black blood made that person black or African, and therefore they could be subject to enslavement, right? Any drop of black blood. Particularly if the mother was black and even if the father was white. If the mother was black and the father was white, okay? So the raping, essentially rape, of enslaved Africans during this time was legal because rape itself was not legal, but the raping of African women was legal at this time. Because they were not seen as women, they were seen as property. So it would be like this person was a desk or a pillow or any other material object, right? So this was a part, and I'm telling this story to give you kind of a historical framework into how we get into the current trends around intermarriage and interracial relationships that we are currently in. So soon they changed the laws so that particularly if you had a black mother and a white father, then the child would take on the social status of the mother. It changed the laws to say that. Now, I want you to tell me, why do you think, or what are the consequences for white men, for white women, for black men, and for black women? What are the implications for all of those people under that one law? That one law affects all of them in various ways. And it tells you about the body meaning and about the level of control and the level of freedom given to certain bodies across lines of race and gender just in that one law. And I want to see if you can grapple with that. So you can pause it here, think about it, and then come back. So if you look at that law, you see that right there, you see the race and gender hierarchy that becomes the basis for US legislation. Not even just race, gender, and sexuality. Because with just that one law, the white male body is dominant. The white male body dominates white men, it dominates white women, and it dominates black men and black women. From a sexual standpoint, and that's just from a social standpoint and an economic standpoint, from a sexual standpoint, that law dominates white women and black women. Homosexuality was still seen as a sin. It was not accepted at this time. So even though people participated in it at that time, it was not something that was addressed, right? But we could go into the history of buck breaking and all of that, where you get into how homosexuality and the raping of enslaved men by white men occurred, right? But that's a whole nother conversation. But in the heteronormative sense, talking about race, gender, sexuality, this shows the way in which white men had this racial, gendered, and sexual mastery over white bodies and black bodies, because it showed that they could have sex with white women when they wanted to, impregnate them, marry them, whatever, right? But then they could also have sex with African women, whenever they want to, and could rape them legally. Still couldn't rape white women legally, even though that obviously happened too, and there was very little punishment for that. But for sure, you could rape a black woman and nobody would care because she was considered property. Now, what does this do? Oh, and then at the same time, this has a class implication as well, because now we can impregnate white women, create more children to do more work. Because the more children you have, the more hands you have to help you with the farm work, the richer you are. So you wanted to have a lot of children. So that was a sexual gratification to white men, and it was also an economic gratification to have sex with white women. To have sex with black women, it was a sexual gratification and an economic gratification, because now legally I can rape this African woman, nothing's gonna happen to me. I can also rape this African woman and receive my sexual gratification. And then on top of that, I could rape this African woman, and if she gets pregnant, this child is going to be enslaved. This child will make me money in the future. In fact, raping this woman is going to, and impregnating her is going to save me money. Because now I don't have to buy a whole new African person. During that time, they say, I read somewhere, they say that the cost would be like buying a car. So your average enslaved African, or the average person who owned enslaved Africans, may have 2 or 3, right? And the very rich people would have 10, 15, 20, 30, right? Just like the average family may have 2 or 3 cars, right? But if I can just impregnate her for free, then I can create a whole new human being, and I don't have to pay. And just wait for this human being who they saw as property to get older, and then they're going to work in the fields. So there's this race, class, gendered, and sexual oppression going on at the same time through these laws. And that law existed all the way up until slavery was abolished. Right. Now, and then even after that, you had, your time of Reconstruction, and then you still had Jim Crow. And during Jim Crow, while it was illegal to rape a woman, regardless of what race she was, it was not uncommon for Black women to be sexually harassed, sexually molested, assaulted, or raped by a white man. And more often than not, they would get away. There would be, especially in the South, there would be few that would actually go to prison. In fact, I can't think of a time, I haven't done extensive research on it, but in the many, many, many books and stories, that I've read, I can't actually think of a situation prior to the Civil Rights Movement where a white man did sexually harass or rape a Black woman, and they actually got a significant amount of time. I don't think I've ever seen it. Not to say it doesn't exist. Anybody who has done research on it will be able to tell you more, but I've never seen it. So it still occurred. There was still this kind of, informal law. Formally, you couldn't do it, you would go to jail, but informally, the likelihood of you going to jail if you're a white man who does this to a Black woman is slim to none. Right? Now, so this is just talking about the race and gender sexuality oppression related to this. Now, if we add on the topic of marriage and love, well, even during the time of enslavement, it was illegal to marry between the races. Interracial marriage was illegal because Black people, African people were seen as property. You had situations like a Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. That's probably the most popular example of this interracial relationship or lover, some may call it, that existed during that time. And it was said that before Thomas Jefferson died, he freed Sally Hemings, he freed all of their kids. They had this love affair and it was mutual. That's debatable, right? But that is probably the most common, right? The fact that there were many mixed race kids on these Southern plantations lets you know that there was a lot of sexual relationships, there was a lot of rape that occurred on these plantations, right? But the marriage and a relationship between a white person and a Black person was illegal. Also, the white woman, this has a certain level going back to the law during enslavement. This has a certain level of control over her body because, and they changed the law so that the child would take on the status of the mother. That means that a Black mother having a mixed race child would have an enslaved child. If a white mother had a mixed race child, then the if a white woman had a mixed race child, then it would take on the it would still be one drop of Black blood. When that law came into place, that would make that child also enslaved. But at one point, that child might be considered free if the mother was white, right? So what this suggests is that there is less of economic reward for a white woman getting pregnant by a Black man and having a mixed race child than it is for a white man to rape a Black woman and have a mixed race child, right? So it would be more of a punishment to the white woman, because now she just created this new person that is now going to take from the family by eating and not really contribute by being enslaved. Does that make sense? And it's actually more beneficial for the white man to rape the black woman economically and then have this mixed race child, right? So this was a way to, again, control the sexual and gendered behaviors of the white woman, the black man, and the black woman. Okay, so white men basically had free reign over everybody, and white women had to think twice. And of course, black people did not have control over their bodies, or legally, according to white folks, did not have control over their bodies. There was a lot of resistance. There were times where enslaved Africans would see a rape happening and would kill the master, so-called master, and then run. There were times where an enslaved woman would kill the master or refuse to be raped and then run away. Things like that occurred a lot. But in terms of legally, there was this boundary over the race, class, gendered, and sexed bodies: white men, white women, black men, and black women. Moving on into post-Civil War, it was still illegal, right? But as we move closer to the civil rights movement, you have more and more people, white and black, who are now having these more open minds. And they're saying that you should be able to date and marry anybody who you want to. And so even before an actual law was passed that would give people the right to marry whoever they wanted to across racial groups, people did it anyway. It just wasn't legal, right? It could be a spiritual union or even within the state, but in terms of, taxes and things like that, they were not seen as a married couple. Not until the law was passed, I believe it was in 1967 or 69, that made it illegal to stop someone from getting married based on race. All right, so now let us go to the next slide. So as now we're in the 20th century, and you start to see where people are having more broader ideas about relationships, especially as other racial groups are starting to come into the country, particularly those from Latin countries. And probably one of the most explicit examples of an interracial relationship, and early popular examples of an interracial relationship, was with the relationship between Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz. I don't know if you were, raised by your parents, grandparents. I don't know if you all are familiar with Lucille Ball. I know you all are from a much more recent generation, but I remember growing up and, watching I Love Lucy, and maybe you've heard of the show, or maybe you've seen a couple of episodes. But Lucille Ball was a comedian. She was an entertainer. She made a lot of money. She was, I think, the first woman to own her own studio. She came about in the 30s and 40s and 50s. And she fell in love with a Cuban man by the name of Desi Arnaz, and they had this show called I Love Lucy. And Desi was her husband in the show and her husband in real life. And she broke barriers by actually having him as a husband. And she broke barriers in terms of interracial relationships by showing them on television being married. There were times where at one point, I don't think they could kiss on television, and it wasn't just them, but you couldn't see a man and a woman in the same bed, even if they were married on television. So they had to sleep in different beds. They didn't want things to be sexually suggestive during those times of like the 1950s. But she broke a lot of barriers, and many times she would not participate or take certain deals if they would not allow for her to show her relationship and expose her relationship in the way that she felt was authentic. Eventually, I think her and Desi did get a divorce, but she always loved and showed love and an appreciation and a respect for her, and they had a child together for her husband, Desi. And so even during these times, there was very, that was probably the biggest and most popular interracial relationship at the time. And then from there, you start to see some of the restrictions on interracial marriage and interracial relationships kind of waning over time, right? Particularly in Hollywood. Still, I want to say the first interracial kiss was in maybe the mid to late 1960s. So again, around the time of the Civil Rights Movement was the first interracial kiss in Hollywood. But before that, depictions of Black people and white people in a relationship were very much prohibited, right? And then you have shortly after that, because of these larger movements, the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power Movement, the Free Love Movement, the hippies, the counterculture that was coming about in the 1950s and 60s. By the time you get to the end, people are saying you should be able to love who you want. The LGBTQ movement is now underway. And so now people are saying you should be able to love who you want to love, have sex with who you want to have sex with, whatever it is that you want to do, you should be able to do it because we live in a free country, right? And so that era and that time leads to this movie called Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. And in this movie, Sidney Poitier, who's probably the first mainstream Black actor, I think he's the first Black actor to win an Oscar. He's a doctor and he meets this white woman from the United States, I think abroad, and they meet, and they fall in love, and he proposes to her, and now she brings him back to meet her family, and they consider themselves to be liberal until they find out that their daughter might be marrying a Black man, and it's actually kind of a comedy, the way in which they play, and they kind of, play into some of these prejudices around the topic, and they use comedy and they use drama to bring out these tough conversations to kind of loosen up the population to actually prepare them for the legal case that we're getting ready to talk about. On the next slide, which is Loving versus Virginia. And so some of you may be familiar with Loving versus Virginia. There's a whole movie called Loving. And there's even a day that some people who are in interracial relationships, somebody I'm familiar with, they're in an interracial relationship, and they celebrate that day. They celebrate the day where the Supreme Court passed the decision to make anti-miscegenation laws unconstitutional and to say that a person should be able to marry who they want, regardless of race, okay? So Loving versus Virginia is about the Loving family. And in Virginia, it was a Black woman and a white man, and they wanted to get married. And they got married, and they had children, and they had a family. But the state of Virginia banned marriages between different races. And so they found them guilty, and they sentenced them to 1 year in prison when they wanted to get married. However, the judge postponed their sentence for 25 years on the condition that the couple leave and not return to Virginia. So eventually they went to, I want to say they went to Maryland, and then I want to say they got married there where it was legal, according to the state. It was legal in Maryland, but their family was in Virginia. So they wanted to go to Virginia. They had a family, they had a farm, they had a house there. That is where they wanted to live. But Virginia would not recognize their union. So they moved to Washington, D.C., and they claimed that Virginia's rule violated the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution. And so what they looked to do with this case was to completely eliminate the sentence altogether so that if they came back to Virginia, they would not have to go to jail. So they tried to get their case heard, and they hired a lawyer, Bernard Cohen, to try to cancel their sentence, to try to get their case heard. I believe on the state level, they upheld the previous verdict on the local level, state level, and then even on the the regional level, if you will, Court of Appeals, all the way, and then eventually the Supreme Court decided to hear their case. So the Supreme Court eventually allowed the Lovings to present their case against the state of Virginia and the ban on intermarriage. And at first they denied it, right? They said they weren't going to hear the case. And then they appealed it. They brought it back to them in 1966. And in 1966, the Lovings appealed to the US Supreme Court again, and then it got denied. And then in 1967, they decided, you know what, we will hold a trial to hear this case. And so a trial was held on April 10th, 1967. And after hearing the trial and after hearing the cases, a unanimous vote was voted in favor of the Lovings family that demolished Virginia's law for good. And once that law was demolished for good, then that set the precedent for other states to have to follow suit to say that a person cannot, or a state cannot, deny somebody the right to marry another person based on race. And so that is where you get that law. Today, gay rights activists have tried to use Loving versus Virginia to help the case of gay people being able to marry, gay and lesbians being able to marry, but most courts will only apply this to racial issues. It does not, most courts don't necessarily use this to make a case for the LGBTQ fight towards equal opportunities of marriage. And so in other states like Mississippi or Georgia and other states, interracial marriage again was banned, and this law kind of forced people to move and progress along to allow for interracial marriage. Still, even well into the 70s and 80s, some states still did not make it legal, right, for people of various racial groups to get married. But because it was a national precedent, it really couldn't hold up for too long. So let's look at today. Are you close to anyone who has been in or is in an interracial relationship? And what are/was some of those experiences? Okay, so we talked about that. What do you, your friends, and or your family think about interracial relationships and or marriage? So what we see, particularly from the readings, is that since Loving versus Virginia, attitudes towards interracial marriage have become more favorable, right? They have become more favorable. More and more people are starting to say that they believe it is okay for people to marry interracially. Let's read pages 138 to 139. And also what we find is that generations as well, as the older generations begin to lose power and die off, and then the newer generations come up, you have more and more people who are more open to maybe even other people marrying interracially. Pages 138 to 139. But let's dig a little bit deeper. So page 138. Since Loving versus Virginia, attitudes towards interracial marriage have become more favorable. A 2011 Gallup poll of American attitudes toward Black-white interracial marriage found that those who were 65 years or older, less educated, conservative, and Republican were less likely to approve of such marriages compared with their younger, more educated, liberal, moderate, Democratic, independent counterparts. Makes sense. The same poll revealed that the South is the least likely to approve of intermarriage of any region in the country. Gallup polls taken from 1968 to 2013 also reveal race to be a factor shaping attitudes. Blacks' approval has consistently been higher than whites over the decades. And in 2013, 96% of Black people approved of Black-white intermarriage compared with 84% of whites. Additionally, though, attitudes have become more favorable over time. 2012 survey of Republican voters found that 29% in Mississippi, 21% in Alabama still believe interracial marriage should be prohibited by law. So there is a difference between approval of interracial relationships and actual interracial relationships. So the approval does depend on someone's race, someone's education, someone's political affiliation. All of these things play a role in how well somebody may approve of interracial marriage or interracial relationships. And again, as stated before, there's a difference between approving of an interracial relationship and then somebody actually getting in one. So what you end up seeing in a lot of these attitudes is that many people will say, I don't have a problem with someone else being in an interracial relationship, but then they themselves will decide, I may not necessarily want to be in an interracial relationship. So I don't think that it should be wrong, but I myself may not participate in that for whatever reason. Which kind of leads us to page 139. What factors contribute to low intermarrying numbers? So again, moving forward, it says, moreover, actual rates of intermarriage though growing, remain low, right? The actual rates are actually low. According to Wang, although interracial marriages reached a record high in 2013, census data reveal that rates of intermarriage-like attitudes towards unions vary widely, and we talked about those variances already. Let's look at this one, the next paragraph. Further Pew analysis of new marriages in 2010 revealed that the majority of interracial marriages were between Latinos and whites, 14.4% between Asians and whites, and the smallest share were Blacks and whites, 11.9%, no doubt reflecting the still taboo surrounding Black-white marriages. So looking at interracial marriages, there is still some politics, there are still some components around larger issues and larger histories of race that have dictated which races decide to get married. Some people are more comfortable with certain races intermarrying more than others, depending on the relationship between that race and white people, right? So this is interesting. We'll talk more about this in the next lecture. Moreover, if we look at outmarriage rates among racial groups in 2013, Native Americans were most likely to marry outside their race, followed by Asians, Blacks, and whites. And one of the reasons, and they talk about this later on, we don't have to read it per se, but we'll talk about it, is number one, the social desirability. So social desirability is people will say what interviewers want to hear, but in actuality, they have more traditional views. So that is one of the reasons why some scholars believe that the acceptance of interracial relationships may be higher than the actual interracial relationships, because sometimes people get in front of a person who's asking them questions and they'll say, oh, of course I think people should marry, whoever they want to marry. But then deep down inside, they really don't think so. They're just saying that because that is what they believe society wants them to say, right? And then another reason, which is what we're going to look at later, is opportunity. So the opportunity for intermarriage rates are not as high because of the larger levels of things like residential segregation, educational segregation, because the likelihood of certain races coming into contact with each other on a regular basis to even decide if they would like to date or want to date or see each other as attractive and feel comfortable dating is limited because of the large numbers of school that have high levels of racial that are racially homogenous. So the likelihood of a white person going to a predominantly diverse school is not very likely. The likelihood of Black people going to a racially diverse school, when we say racially diverse, we mean a mixture of Black, white, Asian, Latinx, kind of evenly. Now you have Black and Latinx people who oftentimes will attend the same schools. And you have Asians and whites that may attend the same school, but a kind of even diversity of that happening is not where it should be, according to a lot of data. So the opportunity to even have these relationships and build these relationships are low because of larger levels of segregation. And so people don't have the opportunity to have and maintain significant relationships with people of various races because the likelihood of a white person not living in a predominantly white neighborhood, or a Black person not living in a predominantly Black neighborhood, or a Latinx person not living in a predominantly Black or Latinx neighborhood, et cetera, because these don't happen based on race and class factors, which also stem from education, it stems from employment, it stems from wealth creation. There are all of these other factors involved. This affects the opportunity to be able to come in contact with someone of a different race and decide if you would want to marry them or not. Last slide. Now we have to look at also the children, right? So there is a whole different set of, there's a different research line around mixed race children, right? And mixed race identity. And so what many people feel is that one main reason why people say they don't approve of interracial marriage is because mixed race children and all these negative stereotypes. One is that some people believe if a child is mixed race, they grow up mixed up, confused, caught between two worlds, and they have no place or no sense of identity, because they believe that a mixed race child would say, well, I don't feel Black enough to be around Black people, but I don't feel white enough to be around white people. So where do I belong? And so they go through this, they go through their entire lives feeling as though they don't belong anywhere. And they call this as well as some other ideas around mixed race identity, the tragic mulatto. One of my colleagues who teaches at the University of Vermont, she studies this. And one day I'm gonna try to get her to do a guest lecture, hopefully here at UNF, where she talks about this notion of the tragic mulatto and mixed race identity. She's mixed race as well. So it's actually quite an interesting line of research. And this kind of dates back to older narratives about mixed race children. If you've ever seen the movie Queen, written by Alex Haley, or if you've ever seen It's a Wonderful Life, you see this tragic mulatto kind of narrative, right? That many people believe is the case for children of a mixed race identity. Also, the notion of passing. And so some of you may be familiar with this, some of you may not be, but this notion of passing was very popular prior to the civil rights movement. These children, mixed race children, who happened to be born with more European features than African features, were oftentimes able to adjust and disguise themselves as white and move around the world as white, even though deep down they were what they called at the time Negro. And so there were several Black folks who were able to pass. But then you also had Black folks of a mixed race identity who did not pass and who identified with their Black side, their Black community. Malcolm X's mother is an example. She was very, 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 very light and probably could pass if she decided to, but she decided not to, and she identified with her Black heritage. There's many other examples. Carl Van Vechten in the Harlem Renaissance was very, very light, but he also kind of identified more with his African side. But you had many, many examples of men and women who looked white, but were really Black, but navigated the world as if they were white. And this tragic mulatto narrative kind of speaks to the so-called psychological damaging that was done to them having to live in these worlds. However, these positive scientific results, so a lot of these negative things that I mentioned are really stereotypes, but the actual results of research on people, particularly children and young adults who have a mixed race identity, are more positive. The more positive scientific results show that people of a mixed race identity are more objective. That was one of the things that people said they felt about President Obama. The fact that he had these kind of multiple communities and multiple social groups in which he was a part of, being part African, but raised by white parents, but living in Chicago, working on the south side of Chicago in a predominantly Black neighborhood, marrying a Black woman, having Black children, moving around in political circles, people of various racial groups. He had this like larger worldview, living in Indonesia for a while. He had this larger worldview that allowed for him to be much more objective and open-minded when it came to making certain decisions. People sometimes feel that mixed race people are able to view others without the racial blinders because they may have more access to other racial groups as opposed to someone who is more than likely largely of one racial group. And so sometimes people feel more comfortable if a person of a mixed race identity makes a suggestion or makes a decision because they feel like the racial blinders may not be there as in a way that is as strong as it is with somebody who's not mixed race. There's a certain pride in their biracial background, and some people feel that biracial people are more well-adjusted. So go ahead and click on this link, and this is actually just a quick kind of confirmation of some of the things that we discussed on this topic. And if you have any questions, reach out to me. This is just the first part of the lectures for this week. The second one is what shapes my attraction. And you can go straight into that video now. Hope you have a great day, great week, great weekend. And you'll see me soon because you're getting ready to click on the next video.